March 27, 1942, RAF Snaith in Yorkshire, England. On a blustery spring morning, a group of officers and mechanics stood at the edge of the field, watching an experiment few believed could succeed. A Halifax bomber roared forward, its 4 engines dragging a massive, silent outline behind it. The object on the tow line looked less like an airplane than a barn with wings, a plywood giant that seemed destined to splinter before it ever left the ground. Yet as the Halifax rose, the glider followed, its long wings flexing, its forward section designed to swing aside and reveal what made it unique: space for armor. This was the General Aircraft Hamilcar, the largest timber-built aircraft Britain would ever put into service. Constructed from birch and spruce with steel fittings only where unavoidable, it had one audacious purpose: to deliver tracked firepower by air. Its cockpit perched high above a cavernous hold, its entire bow hinged sideways so a light tank could drive straight in or out. What the onlookers at Snaith witnessed that day was the first proof that an impossible idea might actually fly. The need for such a craft had grown out of bitter lessons. In 1940 and 1941, as Britain studied German airborne victories, one truth stood out: paratroops could seize ground, but without heavy weapons, they could not hold it. A few rifles and mortars were no match for counterattacking armor. Churchill demanded an answer. Airborne forces must have vehicles from the opening hours. If ships and roads could not supply them fast enough, the skies must. The Hamilcar was the solution. 68 feet long, with a span of more than 110 feet. It was intended to carry the small Tetrarch light tank, or later the American-built M22 Locust. Either machine was modest beside a Sherman or Panther, but in airborne hands it gave confidence. Troops could fight as a combined arms force rather than scattered infantry. For the first time, paratroopers could expect to meet enemy armor with tracked guns of their own. Flying such a giant demanded nerve. Crews trained behind Halifaxes, staring down at a load that weighed 8 tons or more. Once released, there was no second attempt. The Hamilcar had to glide, commit, and slam onto a field at nearly 90 miles per hour, its timber frame shuddering with strain. Then the nose would swing wide, and within minutes an engine would roar to life, tracks clattering into action. The gamble looked like madness, to land a tank inside a glider of wood and glue. Yet by the summer of 1944, these strange aircraft would be flying into Normandy, and later across the Rhine. The wooden giant had proven not just that it could lift, but that it could change the course of a battlefield. Step inside the Hamilcar, and the first impression is volume. The hold runs almost 45 feet long, tall enough for a man to stand upright beside his vehicle. The interior smells of resin and timber, the tang of glue clinging to the ribs. Light leaks through narrow windows, casting bars across a structure that resembles a barn more than an airplane. Everything is built for strength. The floor beams are stiffened with steel, the planks braced to absorb the pounding of tracks. At the front, the great hinged bow dominates. Swing it open, and the interior becomes a ramp to the ground, a direct bridge from sky to battlefield. Loading is its own ritual. Ground crews guide the vehicle slowly up timber ramps, the boards groaning as the weight presses down. Chains rattle as they lock the tracks to anchor points. Every shackle is checked twice. A Tetrarch fits tight, its turret turned sideways to save space. Once inside, there is scarcely an inch to spare. Crews joke that it feels like parking a tractor in a coffin. When the hatch closes and the glider is sealed, the air grows heavy, wood and oil mixing with the smell of hot metal. Above, perched almost absurdly high, the 2 pilots sit beneath a greenhouse canopy. From there, they can see forward over the nose, but behind them is nothing but the curve of plywood. Their controls are bare: stick, pedals, trim, and the instruments few, for a glider allows no second chances. What makes their task harder is the weight beneath. Pilots are responsible not only for themselves, but for 8 tons of armored cargo straining against chains. Takeoff is a test of nerve. The Halifax at full throttle, the tow line snapping taut like a drawn bowstring, and the glider bouncing across the grass until the earth finally lets go. At close to 70 miles per hour, the Hamilcar heaves into the air, its timber frame creaking, wings flexing as if alive. Inside, the armored crew brace themselves, their vehicle chained to the deck like a restless beast. When the tow line is released, the silence is startling. Engines vanish, replaced only by the rush of air across plywood. For the pilots, every second becomes arithmetic. Speed against sink rate, distance against terrain, while coaxing fragile wings toward the chosen field. Landing is violence slowed to seconds. The glider drops steeply, nose pitched down, aiming for ground that may be rutted, muddy, or strewn with obstacles. At nearly 90 miles per hour, the wheels smash down, the frame shudders, and dust rises in clouds. Chains rattle, holding the load in place. The wooden hull skids, often battering through hedges or fences before it halts. Then the ritual begins. Crews rush to unfasten lashings, swing the nose aside, and with a roar, the engine of the armored vehicle bursts into life. Tracks clatter over the ramp and bite into soil. Within minutes of touchdown, steel drives out of timber. Training made this routine instinctive. At RAF Tarrant Rushton, pilots flew endless circuits and bumps, bringing the heavy craft down on short strips. Ground teams rehearsed loading and unloading with stopwatches in hand. Tank crews practiced in darkness, climbing aboard before landing, ready to start engines the moment the signal came. Everyone knew hesitation could prove fatal. The aim was speed, from touchdown to a vehicle free in less than 10 minutes. Yet no one forgot the fragility of their machine. The Hamilcar was immense but delicate, a giant of plywood and glue. A burst of flak could rip its skin, a hard arrival could splinter its ribs. Pilots spoke of the structure flexing in flight, groaning like a living thing under its burden. Some recalled glimpsing daylight through seams where glue had cracked. To fly, it was to trust both craftsmanship and luck. Pride, however, matched the fear. Crews knew they were pioneering a new concept: the delivery of heavy weapons into places where no road or runway existed. When a Tetrarch or a 17-pounder rolled off into a field in Normandy, it proved the gamble could work. Wood had carried steel into battle, and airborne troops were no longer alone. The Hamilcar might have been designed for a tank, but in truth it became a flying warehouse. Its vast hold could take almost anything the airborne commander ordered across hostile skies. Tanks were the headline cargo, but only part of the story. The first passenger was the compact Tetrarch light tank, with thin armor and a 2-pounder gun. Toy-like beside a Sherman, yet for paratroops, it was a tracked shield that could push through hedges, tow weapons, and at least challenge light German armor. A handful landed in Normandy during Operation Mallard, rolling from wooden shells into fields thought unreachable by armor. As the airborne arm matured, another machine appeared in the glider's bay. The American M22 Locust, purpose-built for air delivery, armed with a 37mm gun. Thinly protected and no match for heavy panzers, it was still valuable for reconnaissance and for stiffening a perimeter. In March 1945, Locust crossed the Rhine in Operation Varsity, showing both the promise and the limits of dropping tanks by glider. More often, though, the workhorse cargo was the 17-pounder anti-tank gun. This long-barreled weapon, able to pierce even a panther or tiger, was useless unless it arrived intact, and the Hamilcar was the only glider able to carry it with its tractor. That pairing gave airborne troops real teeth. Alongside came universal carriers, stripped-down bulldozers for engineers and jeeps stacked with radios or ammunition. Whatever the division required, the wooden giant tried to bring it. The bay was wide and empty enough that planners could improvise. Each load shaped tactics. A tank rolling out meant paratroops could probe further, hold ground longer, and bluff the enemy into caution. A 17-pounder meant a bridgehead could resist counterattack until reinforcements arrived. Carriers meant mobility, engineers meant fortifications, and radios meant command could reach further. The glider was not just a delivery system, It was a gamble on what the first hours of battle would demand. Loading choices also shaped the flight itself. A tank pulled the weight forward, making the nose heavy. A gun and tractor balanced more evenly. Crews spoke of learning the personality of each cargo. Some loads made the machine steady, others twitchy, prone to wallow in turbulence. Pilots joked they could feel the cargo breathing under their feet, restless until the moment the bow swung open and it rolled free. What united all these missions was the audacity of using timber and canvas to carry steel. Each time a Hamilcar slammed down and disgorged its load, it proved that improvisation could alter a battlefield. What mattered was not the wood of the airframe, but the effect of what emerged. The night sky over France was already crowded with engines. Parachutes blossomed in the dark, flares drifted down, and flak clawed upward in ragged arcs. Behind the bomber streams came silhouettes larger than anything the Germans expected. Assault gliders, towing steel across the channel. During Operation Tonga, the opening move of the British 6th Airborne Division, Horsas and smaller craft carried infantry and light gear. The heavy Hamilcars with tanks would not arrive until the evening. That lift was Operation Mallard, when 30 giants set out behind Halifaxes and Stirlings, 20 of them loaded with Tetrarchs. The crossing was tense. Pilots sat high in their cockpits, listening for the whistle of flak, feeling the drag of the tug. Inside the holds, tank crews crouched in cramped machines, engines primed, waiting for the order to burst out into a battlefield unlike any training ground. At dusk on 6th of June, as Allied infantry held the beaches, Mallard's Hamilcars arrived. In grim lines, Halifaxes and Stirlings towed the giants across the coast and cast them loose over fields lit by flares. From the ground, the sight was surreal. Vast wooden hulls gliding silently before slamming into Norman soil. Some smashed through hedgerows, some splintered, but enough survived to deliver their loads. Out of one shattered airframe clattered a Tetrarch, turret slewing nervously. From another rolled a universal carrier with men and mortars. Across the landing zones, 17-pounders were dragged into action, crews sweating to emplace them before German armor could counterattack. To paratroopers who had landed hours earlier with only rifles, the arrival of heavy weapons felt like salvation, and the shock spread to the enemy. German defenders had expected parachutists with light arms, vulnerable to quick assault. Instead, they found armor where no road had brought it, anti-tank guns where no supply column had passed. One officer later remarked he could not understand how tanks had appeared in those fields, as if they had simply dropped from the sky. The truth was close enough. The results were mixed but decisive. Tetrarchs were too light to face Panthers in open battle, yet they scouted, harassed, and lent strength to troops clinging to the Orne bridges. The 17-pounders proved decisive. Crews dug them in quickly and met counterattacks the same day. Even wrecked gliders gave up their cargo. One team pulled a gun from a shattered fuselage, set it under fire, and within an hour destroyed a German armored car. Normandy proved the idea. Timber giants could carry steel into battle. They could not replace the Shermans landing from the sea. But for the first hours of D-Day, they gave airborne troops the teeth to hold on. The gamble of building the largest wooden glider in the world had paid off, at least for that desperate morning in France. After Normandy, the Hamilcar had shown both its value and its limits. The sight of tanks rolling out of wooden shells thrilled the divisions. But officers knew the battlefield was changing. German tanks were heavier, defenses were stronger. The tiny Tetrarchs had done all they could. Some broke down, others were lost to guns far stronger than their armor. Still, they had bought time, and time was everything. In Britain, debate filled the War Office. What was the future of the heavy glider? Should it keep delivering light tanks, or shift to more flexible loads? Two answers emerged. First, a new airborne tank, the American M22 Locust. Small, compact, and built for glider bays. Its 37mm gun was weak by 1945 standards, yet it gave paratroops a tracked vehicle with a turret, enough to beat enemy armored cars or strongpoints. Second, the anti-tank gun remained vital. The 17-pounder had been the true star of Normandy. Tetrarchs could not face a Panther, but the long-barreled British gun could. The Hamilcar was the only glider that could carry it with its tractor. So in every new plan, that load came first. Training went on at RAF Tarrant Rushton and other strips. Pilots flew heavy tows again and again. Ground crews practiced loading locusts, measuring every clearance. Engineers worked to make ramps faster and frames stronger. Between missions, each glider needed patching, glue, fabric, and care to keep the fragile hull airworthy. By late 1944, eyes turned east to the Rhine. Market Garden had shown the price of failure. Gliders and paratroops had held too long without relief. The lesson was clear. To cross a river as vast as the Rhine and to hold against the counterblows that would follow, airborne divisions needed more than rifles and light mortars. They would need heavy weapons the moment their boots hit soil. So the Hamilcar was written into Operation Varsity. It was the largest single-day airborne drop of the war. This time, the load was not Tetrarchs. It was locusts, 17-pounders, carriers, and engineer gear. Each cargo was chosen for weight and for purpose. The tools an airborne force needed to survive the first hours. The tank and a glider idea was no longer a test. It was doctrine. The men who trained for Varsity knew the risks. Gliders were fragile. Flak could rip them apart. A rough landing could splinter them in seconds. But without them, divisions would be alone and outgunned. For crews at Tarrant Rushton in the winter of 1945, the Hamilcar was not just plywood and spruce. It was a lifeline. It was the promise of steel in the first desperate hours. At dawn on March 24, 1945, the Rhine sky filled with wings. More than 1,000 transports and gliders carried 2 airborne divisions eastward. Their mission was to seize crossings and hold until the armies forced the river. Among the Wacos and Horsas flew the giants, the Hamilcars. Towed across the channel and over German lines, they carried the heaviest loads, tanks, guns, and engineering equipment. Inside some sat the new M22 Locusts. Their crews crouched in cramped turrets, feeling every vibration. The tow was long and punishing. Flak burst among the streams of aircraft. Shells tore fabric and splintered frames. Pilots gritted their teeth, praying the fragile craft would last until release. Near Wessel, the tugs cut them loose. Hamilcars dove steeply toward smoky fields. Some smashed on ruts and hedges. Others skidded in clouds of dust. Only a few locusts rolled out intact. Most were wrecked or trapped. Yet the survivors drove forward at once, their thin armor rattling as they joined the fight. Other giants delivered 17-pounders and tractors. Crews freed the long guns and dug in within minutes. German counterattacks came fast. Armored cars and infantry probed the landing zones. One British crew fired its first shot less than an hour after landing. The shell tore into a German vehicle that had strayed too close. Engineers, too, reaped the glider gamble. Bulldozers and tools rolled out. Within hours, sappers cleared obstacles and built defenses. What might have taken days by ground convoy was present by noon. Losses were heavy, but the effect was undeniable. Even a handful of tanks and guns turned isolation into survival. For paratroopers in the smoke of Wesel, seeing a locust trundle past or hearing the crack of a 17-pounder meant they were not alone. The Hamilcars had given them teeth. Operation Varsity was the last great flight of the timber giants. They had delivered cargo into Germany, just as they had once done in Normandy. The idea remained daring. Tanks and guns carried not by sea or road, but by air. Inside plywood wings that shattered more often than they survived. Yet for those hours on the Rhine, they proved their worth. The British were not alone in dreaming of armor from the sky. Germany and the Soviet Union tried their own answers. Germany's was scale. The Messerschmitt May 321 Gigant was enormous. It dwarfed the Hamilcar. Its wings spread wider than a jetliner. Its cavernous fuselage could hold a Panzer IV or an 88 mm gun with crew. Built from steel tubes and fabric, it looked like a hangar with wings. To lift it required 3 Bf-110 fighters lashed together in the deadly Troika Schlepp. Later, special twin fuselage tow planes were built. Even then, the beast was dangerous to fly. Both German solutions were dangerous. More than one Troika Schlepp broke apart mid-air, killing whole crews before reaching the front. When the Gigant did fly, it was almost too big to control. Its bulk made it slow. Any fighter or flak battery could find it. Landings were violent. Frames sometimes collapsed on impact. A few Gigants flew resupply runs on the Eastern Front. They carried fuel and ammunition to encircle troops, but they never fulfilled the dream of landing tanks. The size that was meant as strength became weakness. The Soviet Union tried the opposite extreme. In 1942, Oleg Antonov built the A-40 Krylia Tanka, the flying tank. The plan looked simple: bolt wings and a tail to a T-60 light tank. Tow it behind a bomber, release near the battlefield. Let the tank glide down, drop its wings, and fight. A prototype was tested in September 1942. A TB-3 bomber tried to haul it up. The drag was immense. The old 4-engine bomber barely left the runway. After a few minutes, the tow was cut. The tank glided down and landed in one piece. The idea had flown, but it could not be repeated. The TB-3 lacked power. No other Soviet plane could tow it. The project was abandoned. These failures showed how unusual the Hamilcar was. It was not as gigantic as the German craft, not as bizarre as the Soviet flying tank. It was a compromise, just big enough to lift a useful load, just light enough for existing bombers to tow, just strong enough to land without killing its cargo. Others aimed at extremes. Britain built something practical. The Gigant proved size alone was no answer. The A-40 proved ingenuity without power was useless. The Hamilcar, fragile though it was, stayed unique. It was the only glider of the war to land a tank in combat and watch it drive away. When the Rhine was crossed and Germany collapsed, the Hamilcars had finished their job. They had brought tanks into France and Germany. They had carried guns that stopped counterattacks. They had proved that heavy cargo could be flown straight into battle. Yet as crews packed up, they knew the age of the wooden glider was over. The reasons were plain. Gliders had no second chance. Once cut loose, one landing was all they had. Normandy and Varsity had shown the cost. A single shell or a bad field could destroy plane, crew, and load in seconds. After 1945, the world turned to engines. The lesson of the Hamilcar was not always fly tanks by glider. It was armies must move heavy gear fast. The next step was bigger transports. The C-82 Packet and C-119 flying boxcar had wide holds and clamshell doors. Tanks and trucks could roll in and out under power. What Hamilcar did with wood and brute force, they did with engines and metal, and without the one-way risk. At the same time, helicopters appeared. In Korea, they moved men and supplies. In Vietnam, the CH-47 Chinook lifted artillery, vehicles, even bridges across jungles and rivers. The principle was the same as the Hamilcars. Bring heavy weapons straight to the fight. The execution was safer, faster, and repeatable. Still, the Hamilcar left a mark. It showed that wood could carry steel, that airborne forces could arrive with teeth. And for one brief moment in history, the largest wooden glider in the world helped change the shape of battle. The Hamilcar showed that daring logistics could shape battlefields. Air power was not only bombs and parachutes. It was also steel arriving where it was needed most. The glider forced engineers to think beyond road and sea. It gave airborne divisions confidence. For a few hours, they could fight not just as light infantry, but as combined arms. The men who flew them never forgot. Glider pilots recalled the silence after release. They spoke of guiding a wooden building toward the ground, knowing a tank crew waited below. Tankers remembered the violent jolt of landing. They recalled the roar of their engines inside a wooden shell and the burst of daylight when the nose swung wide. For them, the Hamilcar was more than wood and glue. It was a bridge between fragility and firepower. No complete Hamilcar survives today. A few fragments remain. A wing rib here, a fuselage section there. They rest in museums, mute reminders of when wood carried tanks into battle. Visitors often stare in disbelief at how delicate the pieces look. Yet in the 1940s, those fragile frames carried the heaviest hope an airborne soldier could imagine. The wooden gliders that carried tanks into battle were among the boldest inventions of the war. Born of desperation, flown with courage, remembered with awe. Their legacy is not in surviving airframes. It lies in the lesson they left. Logistics needs imagination as much as engines. In a world where steel fought steel, it was timber and canvas that, for a moment, put tanks where no one thought they could be. After the war, the Hamilcar faded from headlines. Its plywood frames were scrapped, burned, or left to rot on empty fields. But the memory stayed alive among those who had flown them. Pilots gathered in reunions. They spoke of night tows over the Channel, of crashes in Norman hedges, of dust clouds on the Rhine. Tank crews told their children how they had once rumbled out of a wooden shell into battle. In museums, the fragments still speak. At the Army Flying Museum, a section of fuselage stands beside photographs of young men who flew it. At Bovington, a broken frame rests near a Tetrarch tank. Visitors see the light timber beams and cannot believe they once carried steel. The contrast is startling. Fragile ribs, heavy armor. A marriage of opposites that worked only for a moment in time. The lesson lives on. Modern armies no longer build wooden giants, yet every heavy-lift helicopter, every transport aircraft that rolls tanks across continents carries a trace of the same dream. Bring power directly to the front. Deliver steel where no road can reach. The Hamilcar proved it could be done. Others perfected it. But it was the wooden glider that tried first, and against the odds, it succeeded.